Alan Carr was once a heavy smoker. At one point, he was smoking close to 100 cigarettes a day while working as an accountant in London. And like many smokers, he constantly told himself he needed to quit. Every time he smoked, he felt guilt. Every time he tried to stop and failed, he felt shame. He later explained something fascinating about that experience. The shame didn't help him quit. In fact, it made things worse. Because after feeling guilty about smoking, he would feel stressed. And what did he do to relieve the stress? He smoked again. Quitting an addiction can be one of the hardest things a person can do. Every time someone sends me a message asking, "How did you do it?" I always pause for a moment, because I know how many people genuinely want to stop. They truly want to end the habit. But quitting is never as easy as it sounds. When they try, they start feeling all sorts of emotions. One of the strongest is shame. And to be honest, I've been there. I know that feeling. The moment when you promise yourself you won't do it again, but somehow you find yourself doing it anyway. And then the shame comes. But there was a time when I realized something that changed the way I saw my addiction. I used to think shame was the result of my addiction, but over time, I realized something deeper. Shame wasn't just the result of my addiction. In many ways, it was actually the beginning of it. There's a quote I once read from a researcher named Brené Brown. She said, "Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change." That quote stuck deeply with me, because when you watch a lot of self-improvement content, you often hear the same message repeated in different ways. That you need to look at your life, realize how badly you've messed up, and almost convince yourself that you're a terrible person before you can improve. But if that's the way you approach change, then you might actually be moving in the wrong direction. Because seeing yourself as a worthless person doesn't create growth. It creates resentment toward yourself. And when you resent yourself, you don't build discipline. You build escape mechanisms. And most addictions are exactly that, an escape from how we feel about ourselves. Back when I was battling my addictions, I was focusing on the wrong things. And if you're struggling with one right now, I bet you might be doing the same thing. I focused on the triggers. I focused on the addiction itself. I focused on my late-night habits. But addiction is rarely just about the habit. It's about the emotional loop surrounding it. And this is true for almost every type of addiction. The moment we shift our focus from the habit to the emotions behind the habit, everything begins to change. In fact, I would say that the moment you start understanding that emotional loop, you are already halfway out of the addiction. Because awareness forces you to see what is really happening. You begin to understand why you keep returning to the same behavior. And at the center of that emotional loop, there is one feeling that shows up again and again: shame. For many people, the cycle of shame becomes even stronger than the addiction itself. And that's where the real trap begins. Psychologists June Tangney and Rhonda Deering studied the effects of shame on behavior. Their research found that people who experience high levels of shame are more likely to avoid their problems, hide their behavior, engage in addictive or self-destructive coping mechanisms. This happens because shame makes people feel powerless to change. So instead of confronting the problem, the brain chooses temporary relief. And like I said, addiction isn't just about the habit. It's about the emotional loop around the habit. A famous study by psychologist Kelly McGonigal at Stanford University examined smokers who were trying to quit. Participants were asked to imagine they had just slipped and smoked a cigarette after trying to quit. Researchers measured two reactions. Group 1, shame/self-criticism. Thoughts like, "I'm weak. I have no self-control. I failed again." Group 2, self-compassion. Thoughts like, "Relapses happen. This doesn't mean I can't quit. I can learn from this and try again." This study shows something very interesting. Shame doesn't actually stop the addiction. In many cases, it strengthens it. Because the people who treated themselves with self-compassion after slipping were far more likely to keep trying to quit, while those who responded with shame and harsh self-judgment were more likely to give up and fall deeper into the habit. So the difference wasn't discipline. It was how they treated themselves after the mistake. And in the long run, the people who believed they were still capable of change were the ones who eventually changed. I'm intentionally showing you studies from psychologists for a reason, because I don't want this to sound like a random opinion or just something I'm saying. I want you to understand that this isn't a hunch. This is something that has actually been studied and observed. Everything I'm talking about here is backed by research. I've taken the time to look into it because I wanted to understand what was really happening. And the more I studied it, the more I realized that many of us are approaching addiction in a way that actually makes the cycle stronger. Many people believe that shame can help them improve and quit their addiction. And in some ways, they're not completely wrong. Shame is a painful emotion, and pain can sometimes push us to change. But living in a constant state of shame is one of the worst mental states you can stay in, because shame keeps you stuck, not growing. However, there is one powerful thing you can do with it. You can redirect that energy. Back when I was in the process of quitting my addiction, I had to stop and realize something important. If I stayed trapped in shame, nothing would change. But if I could transform that emotion into awareness, then maybe I could actually learn from my mistakes. So instead of just feeling bad every time I slipped, I started doing something different. I began paying attention to how and why it happened. Whenever I slipped into the habit, I would stop and ask myself, why did I do that? What was I feeling before it happened? What triggered it? And instead of keeping all those thoughts in my head, I started writing them down. I didn't want to use a physical journal because someone could easily find it. So I used my phone, which felt much more private. And something interesting started to happen. The more I wrote down my thoughts, the clearer everything became. Journaling forced me to slow down and think honestly about my behavior. And that's when I realized something powerful. Self-awareness is the first step to changing anything in your life. You can't fix a pattern you don't understand. And journaling is one of the simplest ways to start understanding yourself. Psychologists have actually studied this as well. Research by James Pennebaker found that writing about your thoughts and emotions helps people process difficult feelings and become more self-aware. And when you become aware of your triggers and emotional patterns, it becomes much easier to break destructive habits. Sometimes the first step to defeating an addiction is simply understanding yourself honestly. Let this be your sign to stop drowning in shame every time you relapse. Instead, take a moment to understand yourself. Try to figure out what you felt, what triggered it, and why it happened. Because that's the mindset you need if you truly want to conquer addiction. Thank you so much for watching.